Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome. I'm really happy to see so many faces. Thursday before Easter, people tend to start their Easter vacation at lunch, but I'm very happy that you're all here. It's a great pleasure to introduce Bruce Campbell, Director of CCAFS, or the CRP, Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security. We've discussed the possibility of Bruce coming for a visit for quite a while, and this happened to coincide with other business you had in Stockholm, so we're really happy to have you here, and we're very much looking forward to the seminar. Very interesting. And there will be opportunity, well, I don't know how you'd like to play this if you take questions during your talk, but otherwise we have until 2-ish. So we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards as well. So please, Bruce, welcome.
Thanks. So actually my Easter holiday should have started yesterday lunchtime because Denmark is a holiday today. But I had to visit the Zimbabwe embassy in Stockholm, so that's why I'm a Zimbabwean dealing with passport issues. So I'm going to talk about agricultural transformation and climate change, because I think if there's one system in the world that really needs to transform, it's the food system. And if we're going to really achieve that, do we have to transform the way we work as researchers? So the first picture was of the Paris Accord 2015. So it set the scene for what's happening in the UNFCCC. But 2009, there was a draft call for a work program on agriculture. It was only in 2017 that they finally achieved this Coronovia work program. Don't look to the UNFCCC for innovative actions. It takes much too long. On the other hand, it does raise the profile of agriculture in the climate change world. And I'll give you an example. There was a UNFCCC Technology Executive Committee meeting on climate change and innovation. And it was all about vehicles, wind energy, transforming the energy and the industrial systems. Agriculture was not mentioned. Essentially, agriculture is not on the forefront of innovation to tackle climate change. And I think that's in relation to the work that many of us do. We have to really change that. The other important thing that the UNFCCC has incentivized global action to shape priorities in climate change. And I can show you that in the next picture. This is essentially a global adaptation program for agriculture. So this is the NDCs, nationally determined commitments. Of the countries, 110 countries have included adaptation in their, have included agriculture in their adaptation programs. You'll notice that Sweden and most of Europe are not on the map, and that's because they haven't prioritized adaptation in their NDCs. They've prioritized mitigation. So we have a global program for adaptation in agriculture. And for mitigation, the red ones, 98 countries have put in GHG reduction targets specifically for agriculture, and 13 countries do economy-wide GHG reductions, which means that agriculture is probably part of them as well. So there's also a global program for mitigation reduction. So I would say this is really significant because 3 or 4 years ago, one would never have thought that the countries have all got together and thought about what they should do. Now, the quality of what they plan to do is another matter, and that is part of the work of researchers, which I'll come to later. And at the same time, the Sustainable Development Goals have been put in place. CCAFS, the program that I lead, the climate change program of the CGIAR, focuses on SDG 13, but as soon as you deal with agriculture and food systems, of course, we have to deal with other SDGs as well, but our focus is 13. So enabling adaptation to deal with long-term change and extreme events, improving human and institutional capacity to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and early warning. embed climate change in national policies and planning, and secure effective finance. So there's also a global action plan around the SDGs for climate change and the other SDGs. But now I want to make the argument that what we're doing at the moment is just totally insufficient. So the first thing is, I think we have to think, we can't think in our little boxes as researchers or development agencies. We really have to think about a system. So this is goal number 13, which has got both mitigation actions and adaptation actions in it. If you think about adaptation actions, there's going to be lots of synergies with some of the other SDGs, life on land, life on water, etc. And for food systems, now my eyes are testing, but fortunately I can remember. We have to deal with food loss and waste, we have to deal with consumption shifts, and we have to reduce the agricultural footprint. On adaptation actions, there's also a whole lot of synergies around hunger, poverty, gender, inequality, equality. And in those actions, we're dealing about yield increases, reducing the risk to farming, reduce production losses, so it's once again food loss and waste, and better functioning markets. And you can imagine there's a whole lot of synergies with some SDGs if you do mitigation action, and a whole lot of synergies with some SDGs, but there's going to be definitely trade-offs. And how to deal with these trade-offs has to make us think outside our little boxes. Two of the key SDGs for us are these two, actually, 12 and 17. So 12 is responsible consumption and production, which kind of captures it all. And number 17 is partnerships, that you're never going to deal with these things without massive, good partnerships. And we have to recognize, so we see that a transformative approach is essential, and we see that some countries are going to focus on various things and other countries are going to focus on other kinds of things. So it has to be taken into account the country-specific needs. The second reason for needing a transformative approach is because of planetary health. And I don't know if many of you have seen, you probably have, because the key mover behind this has been Rockstrom in Stockholm. But Stefan has produced the latest paper where climate change, land systems, and freshwater use are all in the yellow increasing risk zone. Biodiversity, integrity, genetic diversity, and these biogeochemical cycles are in the red high-risk zone. There's some things where they haven't worked it out yet. What we've done recently is looked at the role of agriculture in shifting those planetary boundaries, and it's the blue. And as you can see, if there's any one system that is driving planetary health, it's probably agriculture. On top of this, 1.5 billion people at the moment are supposedly depending on degraded land. That's, if you're going to solve hunger and poverty, that cannot be the case. The third reason for transformation is the challenges in ourselves, how enormous they are. So by 2030, end extreme poverty. End hunger and achieve food security, zero child stunting. To put it in blunt terms, we have to reach 500 million farming households by 2030 and enhance their resilience to climate change, amongst other factors. So in my program, that's the target essentially. Reach 500 million people by 2030. It's an enormous target to achieve, which is not going to be done by business as usual research and development. And we have to change the agricultural system, but reduce emissions at the same time. This is the current emissions from the global system. 2010, the blue is non-agricultural emissions, the yellow is agricultural emissions. By 2050, this is what we're on target to do at the moment. It will go up to 70 and 15. What do we have to do by 2050 if we want to achieve a 2-degree world, let alone a 1.5-degree world? We have to bring global emissions down from the business as usual case of 85 gigatons down to 21 gigatons. It's an enormous task. And if agriculture doesn't do anything, we will be 70% of allowable emissions in 2050. Now, you can't imagine that the other sectors are going to let agriculture off. Agriculture is going to have to also really change its way of doing business. The fourth reason is the fact that our current levels of innovation and change are nowhere near enough. So let's just take the ending hunger SDG. This is the dark red is the current trend. The current picture, and that if we continue on that trend, it's the dotted lines. So what we have to do for this particular SDG is greatly speed up our rate of change. And now let's look at mitigation. Agriculture sector, scientists have worked out that methane and nitrous oxide emissions have to be reduced by 1 gigaton by 2030 if we want to stay in the 2-degree limit world. So the dark line at the top is the baseline situation, kind of business as usual, and the 2-degree scenario is below. This is agricultural emissions. And we have to reduce our emissions by that much by 2030 if we want to keep to the 2-degree target. They estimate that current technologies can only achieve 20 to 40% of that emission reduction. So a major challenge in the mitigation area as well. And this is mitigation in developing country, developed country agriculture. It's globally. So if you believe me that we need a transformation, what does that mean in the agricultural space? So often, and I'm from the CGIAR, often we get stuck in this little box, which is all about technologies. Climate resilient and low emission practices and technologies. And definitely it's essential. But there's many other things that have to be considered. And if we're really successful in this little box, we will be at the same table as Elon Musk, for example, talking about Teslas. And that's what we have to achieve in agriculture. And in the UNFCCC, we're nowhere near that table yet. We believe that there has to be massively expanded private sector activity and public-private partnerships. So the Green Climate Fund is aiming to get 100 billion. The private sector has trillions to invest. And essentially what we hear is that they've got more money than they've got bankable projects. And in agriculture, we're always complaining that we haven't got enough money. How do we get the private sector truly involved in the agricultural sector? Getting credit, index-based insurance to farmers so that farmers can invest in the technologies that come out. Really strong farmer organizations and networking at ground level for adaptive capacity, networking, and local organizations have been shown to be really important. And if you're going to take a private sector approach, we need strong farmer organizations to match the power of the private sector to demand services and demand to pull down prices. Climate-informed advisories and early warning. So this is all about extension, having good extension systems, and as we know in developing countries, they're really poorly developed. And also linking it's not only the agricultural side, but linking that seamlessly into humanitarian assistance and emergency response through early warnings. We think a game changer will be digital agriculture, where farmers are even smallholder plots in a decade, can use a smartphone and type in a specific question for their particular farm and get a specific answer back again in a decade's time. Prioritization and pathways out of change. So the problem with agriculture, unlike wind energy, where you can put up a very similar wind turbine in many different places, is that it's so context specific. And there's this great technique called alternate wetting and drying in rice systems, where you can reduce greenhouse gases by up to 50%. But in some locations, you put the same technique in, it'll increase greenhouse gas emissions. So the you have to really have really good targeting for biophysical conditions and also for socioeconomic conditions. What kind of farmers can do what? And to recognize that a private sector approach is going to leave some farmers behind. And therefore, social safety nets, other options are really crucial as well. And lastly, capacity, enabling policy, and institutions. And being a Zimbabwean, I can say these sorts of things, is that in some places, it is a waste of time working because the enabling conditions are just not good enough. So you're going to be working on small pilots which can never get to scale. Perhaps in those locations, the social safety net issues, humanitarian and emergency response are much more important. But if you want a truly scaled up set of activities, you need good policy instruments and functioning institutions. So that's our vision for where we need to see research and development. And at the moment, within my sphere, which is the CGIAR, I'd say we have much too much focus on the technology part. We've just hired a person, which must be the first person in the entire CGIAR, who's on deals with creative finance, financial mechanisms, dealing with blended finance, how does public finance mix with private finance, how does it de-risk private sector investment. And in each one of those boxes, you can think about the kinds of research and development that one needs. I think we also have to change the way we do research. And each year, what we do is we assess our program participants' work by they deliver outcome statements, either progress towards outcomes or actual outcomes. And after 5 years of work on this, we've looked at all the outcomes and tried to pull together some of the lessons. So one of the principles of the kinds of research that I think we need is the 3/3 principle, where a third of the resources of researchers goes to engagement, a third into evidence producing, and a third into outreach. So by engagement, really understanding the needs of the key stakeholders who are going to drive change, and taking a very participatory approach. By evidence, we still think that scientific credibility is really important for a research organization, so that is the publication of really good papers. But also something which isn't often part of a research mandate is opportunism and flexibility. To achieve outcomes, opportunities emerge all of a sudden with a private sector player, with a government, etc., etc. And there's a real need to be able to shift the research agenda to meet the instant needs that may come up. And then outreach. So we really believe that strategic communications is important. And this is not PR. It should be communicators who understand theories of change and impact pathways so that they are able to get the messages to the right people. And capacity building is really crucial. And it's not the sort of training courses. Training courses are one thing, but ongoing engagement and partnership with key players. And it's often two-way, where researchers perhaps learn as much as the people they're working with. Another key element within the program that I lead is results-based management. So this is a bit of a ruthless side of us, is that we expect people to focus on outcomes. We kind of take it for granted that they're going to do good research, though we also assess the quality of the research outputs. But we're much more looking for researchers who are engaged, participate, and help to deliver outcomes. So to allocate funds, we also take a rather ruthless approach, is if there's extra funds to be allocated, we allocate it to the performing elements, to the areas of research which look promising. And if there's budget cuts to be made, we cut the low-performing element. And therefore, we're not that popular in the CG. So we actually, and now the last part of the talk, the last 5 minutes, is going to be on some of the kinds of things that we do as a program, using those sort of principles of research. We only focus at the moment, we only focus in these countries. We do work outside those areas, but given the resources, we believe you need to focus if you want to do this engagement and outcome delivery. We work right from the ground in things we call climate smart villages, which are essentially testing beds for farmer participatory work, or participatory work with microcredit agents or with extension, usually a whole set of partners. At national level or regional level, we have science policy platforms. In each of these regions, we have regional program leaders who are scientists, but above all are facilitators, engagement specialists, or good partnership makers. And here's one particular example. So our regional program leader in India, when he first was hired by the program, we were a bit nervous about him because he was a great scientist and we weren't so sure about his facilitation side of the things. And in the first year or two, he complained about, should scientists be doing this, should scientists be doing this? And then he got into it. And he's probably the most brilliant person in terms of understanding what is needed. So he's engaged with the insurance industry to understand what their problems are. The government, because they subsidize the insurance industry, what are their problems? And the farmers, what are their problems with it? And essentially all three players didn't like what was happening. And then he did really good science, which relates down to satellite imagery, crop modeling, and designed new indices for the insurance industry, which satisfies farmers, insurance industry, and government. And within 3 seasons of work, he was reaching 1 million farmers in India with an insurance product. So for me, it was a lovely example of you can still do great science, but understand what is really necessary. Another example is from West Africa. So this was climate information, which is used before the season to do various things, during the season to do various things, and towards the end of the season to do various things. And sort of detailed work from Burkina Faso shows us that if farmers get climate information services, up to a half of them can change practices because they now understand what's going to happen. There was 6 times more improved seed being used by the farmers getting information as opposed to farmers not getting information. And this particular regional program leader, together with many others, delivered climate information services tailored to women and men farmers to 7 million farmers after roughly 3 seasons of work. But also showing you the need for him to be a great partnership player in terms of pulling those kinds of partners together, working with rural radio associations, capacity building for them to how to deliver probabilistic messages around weather, for example. And the other part of this one was the government really interested in institutional reform and the linkages between the Ministry of Agriculture and the Meteorological Agency. So we work in about 20 to 30 countries. And this is work that we do with risk profiling, essentially prioritizing agricultural practices for different countries. As a particular example, Kenya, where they've gone down to the county level. They've done it in 47 Kenyan counties. And then this work has then informed a $250 million World Bank Climate Smart Agricultural Project. So once again, nice science, but very much linked into ongoing processes in terms of investment by major players. Climate Smart Villages, I mentioned to you, this is a particular example from Niger, where they're doing water harvesting, climate information services, capacity building, something around the environmental issues, carbon sequestration, etc. And based on the crops relevant to the particular farmers they're working with. The problem with this kind of work could be that it becomes these wonderful little pilots on the ground where, wonderful, but 10 kilometers away, there's nothing. But we've indicated to regional program leaders that you can never do anything as a pilot. It all has to be part of a theory of change. Oops. How did that jump so fast? And in this particular case, it linked into a major World Bank funded project, 150 million, where CCAFS will be technical backstopping, identifying and helping scaling up CSA options. So, in conclusion, I've tried to make the case that there's some real mega challenges and we need to take a transformative response. And in so doing, I think we also need to rethink the way we do research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Very interesting, as always. Questions, comments? Or you're all shocked and challenged?
I'm sorry. Thank you for a very interesting and important presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned the importance of the private sector actors to be engaged. In what way are you working with them differently now than before?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's always has been some activity with private sector, but probably not sufficient. And so I would say the one thing that's happened is a massive scaling up of activity. At the global level, this week, we are with the major food companies in the world with a 250 billion revenue, working with them to set targets for mitigation and reduce and how to measure it. So that's at the global level, for example. I think the work with insurance companies is greatly expanded. The work with microfinance and impact investing is greatly expanded. I think the traditional private sector parties have been things like perhaps seed companies, etc. There's a whole new expansion in digital ICT-based work. So I'd say it's the scale of the work, taking much more seriously than before.
Well, I have some background in working with the private sector in those countries, like you mentioned, in Uganda, for instance, and Ethiopia. It is quite a challenge. Because first of all, we're talking here mitigation and adaptation, but very often those local farmers will lack any kind of farming practice as such. So we need to be taught kind of routine manners, how to do a kind of business-related farming as such, and which varieties one would use and which would be best to sell later on. So we're actually not having that kind of practice. So we are not talking here to the companies. But in case we want the farmers really getting into the thing, we need to interact with the kind of smallholder farmers. And that's a real challenge because we really lay behind. So if research needs to go there needs to be some kind of backup that the researcher gets that interaction and gets his message through. And these kind of organizations would kind of helping organizations for a researcher to do this would be welcome.
I totally agree with you. It's not simple. I mean, working with the private sector, first of all, I mean, the private sector objectives are often very different from the public sector objectives. One has to look for some kind of sweet spot between them. And then working with farmers on the ground in terms of actually taking up improved seed or getting involved in value chains. You can understand why they don't do it. It's too risky. It's those sorts of issues. But I don't think we can leave it at that. I think otherwise those farmers are going to be left behind. I've worked deeply in southern Zimbabwe, for example, and it's a major challenge for the farmers to get into the private sector, value chains, etc. And one has to recognize that some areas in the world are going to be left behind, and that there's different approaches needed. So in the particular area that we were working at, had a beautiful road just 5 kilometers away, so it wasn't a case of infrastructure. It was just a case of remoteness from the market and prices that would not work for those particular farmers. One has to start with if you want a revolution in the way agriculture is happening in developing countries, one has to start with the easy places. And for example, in Ethiopia, I was amazed by the transformation that actually has taken place in some sectors in Ethiopia in the last decade. And I think essentially that needs to happen in many other places. But I agree with you, it's very challenging. And if the markets and the prices don't work for the farmers, they're not going to do it.
Yeah. Do you see a difference between the technology and research and conditions needed when working with poor farmers and not so poor farmers? Do you have models for both cases, or do you have an active approach to that?
So I would say that the best approach that I've seen is where there's a really good understanding of the farmers in terms of their abilities. So some kind of classification or understanding that there's farmers X, Y, and Z. And actually the work in IITA in Uganda is wonderful in terms of that, really understanding the farmers' needs and then earmarking solutions for the different groups of farmers. So there is that kind of work happening. On the rice example that I gave, alternate wetting and drying of rice only works with certain kinds of farmers, and there's some wonderful targeting work which has been done to identify areas where you can move forward with alternative wetting and drying, and other areas where you have to do something different. So there are examples like that. And if I would say that if you don't do that kind of stuff, then you're really in trouble. Because it's not going to work anymore.
I'm just thinking if you could kind of share a little bit about your climate smart villages. I've not met those while being in those countries. I have seen farmers field schools. So how do those climate smart villages function?
I'm guessing that perhaps farmer field schools are very similar to what we've got. We're the climate change program of the CGIAR, so we have to think in a climate way, otherwise we step on everybody else's toes. So we give more focus to climate information coming to farmers and advisories which are linked into climate information. We give more focus on things like, in this particular place, do we actually have to transform to a totally different system in the next coming decades because of the likely trends in the climate? And we give perhaps more attention to the mitigation issues. How do you reduce greenhouse gases where appropriate? The actual places where we work are multi-stakeholder platforms, essentially, of the extension services, the government research agencies, the international researchers, microcredit banking. Depending on what partners are necessary in particular locations, they come together and decide what should happen together with the farmers, and then they test out the mechanisms. In the case of, just to give one example, in Senegal, at the Climate Smart Village, they were testing climate advisories. What do women farmers want? What do men farmers want? And then that was used as information when they scaled it up to the 7 million farmers, the advisories. So they're testing grounds for things which can hopefully be scaled up to different levels.
How big are those villages?
It depends on the country and the location, and actually village it's probably the wrong term. It's because they're never a single village. It's a district in some places, a landscape in other places, 50 villages in other places. So they're kind of different scales, depending on the location.
But just to follow up, as you referred to your work on RBM, I guess those you can find a lot of outputs from those your experiences from those villages on your web, or how do you?
It's a lot you will find on the web. I can share a link with Ilva who can circulate it. Yeah.
How do you relate to the other CGIAR institutes? Are they continuing business as usual, or are you supporting the others to also become or do research for climate smart agriculture?
So it's a great question. I also noticed that I'm being recorded. So we actually work with all the CG centers. They're all part of the program to bigger and smaller amounts. And just to take an example, Climate Smart Villages is actually, we will be testing some of the technologies and practices that do come from the different CRPs, the different research programs in the CGIAR. So, for example, the Kenyan Climate Smart Village, there's work from SIP, there's work from ILRI, there's work from ICRAF, and probably two of Summit as well. So there's each place where we work is dependent on the particular context, and we invite the players in. Sometimes they do come from the national systems as well. For example, if the national system is dealing with drought-tolerant maize or something like that. So we work with them there. Our results-based management system works with all the partners that participate with us. So, and because the CG centers do participate with us, they're all part of that.
Thanks. My question links a little bit to that one. I'm working with a global soil partnership that's based at the Food and Agriculture Organization. So it's more of a soils focus, but the question I think is more general, where part of it is focusing on increasing soils research within agriculture especially, but looking at collaboration between different institutions. And we often get the comment that so many people are doing work, but everybody is doing their own thing. And I think what you presented about how we need to transform research is very relevant, and some of the aspects are being addressed. So my question is, how do you see the benefit and an institution like CGIAR fitting into collaboration and coordination at a global level? Because part of the idea is to establish in this case again, soil research internet platform where you start listing and assessing all the institutions that are doing this kind of research. What is the infrastructure? What are the challenges? What are the people and what are the research gaps? And again, your presentation fits in perfectly to that. To start to give people that have no idea access to what is happening, but also give institutions that are doing a lot the opportunity to show what they're doing and how they can link with others. So the question is, do you see value in something like that? And do you have any suggestions?
I think there's enormous value in these kinds of learning networks that are out there. I guess the problem is that there's a lot of happening, and it's quite difficult to participate in all these things, because otherwise you'll never get anything done, essentially. So in some ways, one has to be really strategic about partnerships, networks, which partners you choose. And so, just as an example from CCAFS, we actually, and our management team, we have quite hard discussions about should we partner with this new initiative or not, because essentially it takes away time from doing your business elsewhere. And in some cases, we will decide we don't think we can afford to partner with X and Y, just because of the time issue. So I think these things are really valuable, but it's a really crowded space, and one has to be able to show value for money in terms of getting membership and that sort of things.
Bruce, do you work with other organisations? I'm thinking of ISIPI with their Adapt, Push, Pull. This is doing very well. Is that sort of thing you take on board in CCAFS?
That's also a great question, because personally, I think any organisation, including the CG, should be looking beyond its own stuff. And we, as an example, we wanted to have a climate information and climate risk piece of CCAFS. And we did a competitive call for the leadership of that, and the best call came from outside the CG. And so they are leading the work. Right. So we really believe that it's important to look beyond the borders of your own organisation. And, that's a challenging thing for some people, yeah. And within taking on technologies from other organisations, that's also perfect. That's fine. So, in the case of some of the climate smart villages, we're using technologies that are not from the CGIAR.
And then another question about the CRPs. I heard a little criticism that some of the CRPs are too rigid. Mm-hmm. They lack this opportunism to react and take on new order. I think that's. I've heard the criticism from other places as well. Yeah. It's something I think we ought to push.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. Like, for example, our emerging belief that if you don't deal with impact investing and that kind of area of activity and how they can incentivize essentially the older-fashioned agricultural development stuff, or vice versa, is really crucial. And then being able to find the money to fill those gaps is difficult, but I think hard decisions have to be made, and some things have to, if you haven't got more money, you have to reduce something to fill the strategic goals. And within CCAFS, we feel we've got enough ability to be able to do that stuff.
Yeah.
What do you see the benefit of cooperating with universities? Because the research approach is quite different within this research for development paradigm in the CG versus the very slow academia and university systems who also engage in teaching and so far. So what are docking stations within CCAFS in particular to cooperate with universities? And or do you have any successful projects where you saw the benefit of collaborating with universities from the global north?
Yeah.
Because, a lot of projects want to have actually capacity development, which is very understandable with universities from developing countries.
I'm glad you think that the academia is slower than the CGIAR. I don't know what Ilva thinks. But I think the CGIAR is quite slow as well. So we think it's essential to interact. So first of all, a lot of our work is engagement, working with partners, those sorts of things. And therefore one needs people who are going to focus on a very specific problem and solve that particular problem for us. And that's often academic institutions in the global north or in the global south. And then training, bringing students into the whole process of the research is really crucial as well. And we can't have students. We can only have partnerships with organizations that have students. As an example, we have a network of PhD students on greenhouse gas emissions from developing countries. And there's an intake of about 30 students at any one time. And this is fantastic for us. So they all come from different universities. So it's because they're doing detailed work on a specific crop in a specific place. And that's fantastic. If you know about GHG measurements in developing countries, they're hopeless, essentially. The emission factors are terrible. So our estimates of mitigation in developing countries is really poor. So having those kinds of inputs are fantastic. And you can do that for the whole range of social sciences, technological work. So it would be fantastic, it's really great to have those connections.
Bruce, I'm thinking about attracting the private sector. CEDA has two instruments, loans and guarantees, which are just for that, to get private money into a program, and they guarantee the investor that he'll get his money back, or she'll get his money back. And there's been some good examples. All of my colleague here is, well, go on. Drill the one for Tanzania.
Well, one recent example is in Tanzania, where we have put a guarantee for private investors in the seed industry. And it's been quite successful. Mm-hmm. We have, but maybe I can follow on with a comment now, because we have, my question is how to link research and private sector better, because we have a number of instruments, public-private partnerships, as you mentioned. We have these innovation or challenge funds, which is similar to research funds, but focusing more on how to make good ideas profitable and commercial. Mm-hmm. And we have other instruments like loans and guarantees. But somehow when going through applications for these different funding mechanisms, we don't see much from the research side. Mm-hmm. We see a lot of businesses, we see NGOs, we see one or two researchers who want to become commercial, but very little from research organizations and universities. Mm-hmm. Is it because universities are more focusing on research papers and so on? Or why don't we see more? Because that's where the knowledge is, and that's where the ideas are.
Mm-hmm. That's where the money is. Yeah. A big slice of the budget.
Yeah.
Because I think there's so much going on in universities all over the world, even though agriculture is seen as yesterday's business, very much in development cooperation, unfortunately. But there are a lot of what you presented here. I think we know basically what we need to do, but it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. And at CEDA, I think both Philip and I feel that there is a sort of a gap between what we know and get it implemented. Because the private sector won't solve our problems, because they will only invest if they are secure and ensure that they get the money back. Yeah. So someone else has to take the first step, I think.
So I can't speak for the Swedish academic community, but I think that, and this is perhaps not the thing to say at a university, is that the incentives for scientists are still too old-fashioned in terms of that they're purely on papers. And so within our program, the incentives for our regional program leaders, our flagship leaders, the project leaders have really shifted. It's 15% publications, and all the rest is engaging. Have you done a good gender work? Have you producing outcomes, partnerships? And we almost assume that the research, that'll happen whatever happens, because they will want to produce some papers. So the incentive shift has shifted a lot, and I think that I would say universities have to also shift a bit. Perhaps, I'm not speaking for Sweden. I can give an example from Copenhagen, where I'm sitting at the moment, or Australia, or Zimbabwe. Yeah. So I think it's quite difficult, unless the incentive system shifts, to really get researchers in part of the process. But it seems like our finance person would be really interesting to speak to you as well, the person that we've just hired. Because he's really thinking about even bigger level things in terms of really bringing on the trillions into the agricultural space.
So in terms of the boxes you had, and you had the policy box up to the left, and we have a program that is coordinated by SLU working on policies related to agriculture. So what's been your strategy? How have you built that capacity, and how do you work with policies? That's one question. And then the other one, you talked initially about the dialogue you're having with private sector at a very high level. How did you get to that? How did you get to that platform to be that partner? That's doesn't happen just because you have an acronym.
Okay, so now remember the second question, which was getting to the first one is?
About the policy work. How do you do that in India? Yeah.
So I think the policy work is also taking those, our 3/3 principles, is that to the very start is engagement with the policy makers, where if it's a national level or a regional level or a global level. And so we have, at the global level, I have deep engagement with the negotiators around the world. I know most of them personally, developing countries and developed countries. We have somebody who's specialized. We took a strategic decision to work with the World Business Council. That person's went there and spent a good period of time understanding what their needs were, and therefore they opened the doors to the major food companies to us. So it was a strategic decision to engage and understand what their needs were. And the same thing happens down at the national level, but I'm not responsible for that. That's the regional program leaders. So the first step is always this sort of deep engagement and understanding what is needed, and then producing the work, and often through an engagement process. So, I can just give one real example. Building scenarios and climate forecasts for Cambodia, together with the policymakers, ultimately ended in the Cambodian government's $140 million climate resilience program, where they've fleshed out the thing. So it was participatory policy analysis, with scientific papers also coming out from it, but also almost ensured of an outcome at the end of it through the participation. But of course, it doesn't always happen. So we worked in 20 countries, and perhaps it works in 6 or 7 countries, and then it goes haywire in other countries because of various things happening. So it's kind of that deep engagement, and I think that answered the second question as well.
Yeah.
We just as another example, we see the World Bank as a major investor in climate smart agriculture. We decided to give resources to a specific individual to be seconded to the World Bank to understand exactly what was needed. And that then helped us vision our work in terms of the World Bank. So once again, it comes back to taking a few, really being very strategic about who you're going to work with to make change, because you can't do it with everybody.
Can I ask another question? The CCAFS program, your program, at CIDA, we have changed a lot of focus in our bilateral cooperation from, how shall I say, more stable countries to countries affected in one way or another of conflict or social unrest.